They didn't just ask Claire Whitmore to leave. They threw her out like she was absolutely nothing. The sound of the heavy mahogany front door slamming behind her echoed down the quiet, affluent street, sharp and incredibly final, like a brutal verdict that had already been passed. The freezing rain soaked through her thin trench coat within seconds, chilling her to the bone. In her shaking hands were two suitcases that weren't even full. This wasn't because she had packed light by choice, but because almost everything she owned, everything she had built over a decade and a half, had already been systematically taken from her. She stood shivering on the wet pavement and pulled out her phone. It buzzed. Exactly once. A weak vibration against her cold palm, and then went completely dead. It didn't matter anyway. The bank accounts were totally frozen. The credit cards were relentlessly declined. Even the rideshare app refused her desperate request for a car. Claire stood alone under the flickering, harsh yellow glow of a street lamp, watching the warm, inviting lights of the massive mansion she had lived in for 15 years go dark, one by one. Inside those walls, her husband, Grant Holloway, was already celebrating. He had won, or so he arrogantly thought. To the outside world, Claire was just another discarded wife. She was viewed as a woman who had willingly given up her promising career, her fierce independence, and her very voice for a wealthy, powerful man, only to be swiftly replaced the moment she became inconvenient. By tomorrow morning, ruthless gossip blogs would call her mentally unstable. By the afternoon, expensive corporate lawyers would paint her as greedy and vindictive. And by nightfall, she would officially be labeled exactly what Grant had always secretly believed she was, completely disposable. But Claire didn't cry. Not yet. Pure shock held her upright significantly more than her own strength did. Her pale hands trembled violently as she dragged the two rolling suitcases down the dark, flooded sidewalk, her high heels clicking unevenly on the wet concrete. Each step she took felt infinitely heavier than the last, as if the massive city itself was actively conspiring to push her away into the shadows. What absolutely no one could see, however, was the heavy truth pressing hard against her ribs. It was a truth locked securely behind 15 years of suffocating silence and a sacred promise she had never, ever broken. It was a promise her mother had made her swear to keep on her deathbed, no matter how terribly unfair life became. Don't speak. Don't fight. Not yet. Across town, high up in a glittering, glass-walled penthouse, Grant Holloway raised a crystal champagne glass with a deeply smug smile. He confidently told his young mistress that Claire would inevitably fold within mere days. He laughed, stating she had absolutely no money, no powerful allies, and zero leverage left to her name. But he was catastrophically wrong about one vital thing. Claire Whitmore was indeed walking into the absolute darkest night of her Entire life, yes. But she was also walking straight toward the exact moment that would change absolutely everything. And when her true name was finally spoken, out loud, it wouldn't just stop a polite conversation. It would completely freeze an entire federal courtroom. With nowhere else to go, Claire slept on a narrow, unforgiving wooden bench inside a 24-hour bus terminal. She folded her damp coat under her head, like a thin, pathetic apology to her aching body. The harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead never dimmed. They hummed relentlessly, a maddening sound that made time feel entirely frozen and deeply hostile. Every few minutes, heavy footsteps passed by, loud voices echoed off the tiled walls, and the wheels of travelers' luggage rolled past. Absolutely no one looked at her twice. She was just another invisible soul in a city of millions. By the time morning finally broke, her body ached profoundly, but her racing mind hurt so much more. She washed her pale face in a grimy public restroom, staring deeply at her reflection in the spotted mirror as if the face belonged to a complete stranger. Her eyes were red and heavily swollen, not from crying, but from the immense physical pressure of holding absolutely everything in. She barely recognized the hollowed-out woman looking back at her. 15 years earlier, she had been incredibly sharp, fiercely driven, and halfway through a grueling law school program. She was full of brilliant arguments and an unyielding fire. She was entirely ready to win at life. Then, she met Grant Holloway. Grant had absolutely loved that fiery version of her at first. Or, at the very least, he deeply loved what her brilliant mind did for him. He loved having a woman who could advise him quietly in the shadows, a woman who could flawlessly correct his complex corporate contracts long before his highly paid lawyers ever did, and a woman who would never, ever ask for the public credit. When he finally proposed, he promised her a true, equal partnership. He promised her absolute safety. He promised, looking deep into her eyes, that she would never have to worry about anything ever again. And slowly, devastating promise by devastating promise, she completely disappeared. Claire vividly remembered the exact day she formally withdrew from law school. Grant had masterfully framed it like a generous gift. Why struggle and stress yourself out, he had said, kissing her forehead, when I can easily provide absolutely everything we will ever need. She had foolishly told herself it was only a temporary break. Then came the lavish marriage, the constant moves across the country for his promotions, the endless, exhausting long dinners with wealthy investors where her only real job was to smile prettily, look elegant, and stay completely silent. Each passing year, her vibrant world grew significantly smaller, and her once powerful voice grew softer, until it all culminated in last night's brutal eviction. By noon of her first day on the streets, cold reality arrived with brutal, unforgiving clarity. She managed to charge her phone at a public kiosk, but she still had no cellular service. Her personal email was entirely locked out. The passwords maliciously changed. Finally, a single, chilling notification from a legal app managed to load on public Wi-Fi. It was just one devastating line. Long, temporary restraining order granted. No access to marital residence. No access to joint financial assets. Claire's hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the phone onto the terminal floor. She desperately tried to call Martin Keller, the one attorney she genuinely believed she could still trust. It went straight to voicemail. She frantically emailed him, but the message immediately bounced back as undeliverable. By mid-afternoon, the horrifying scope of her reality set in. She finally understood exactly what Grant had meticulously done. He hadn't just callously left her for another woman. He had systematically erased her entire existence. Worse still, another terrifying digital notice appeared on her screen. It was an aggressive debt collection alert. It referenced a massive corporate loan she absolutely didn't recognize. Her name was legally attached as the primary guarantor to a dollar amount so staggeringly large it made her empty stomach violently turn. She frantically scrolled through the attached legal documents in pure disbelief. Her signature was right there on the dotted line. Or, at least, it was something forged incredibly close enough to pass a casual inspection. This wasn't just a messy divorce. It was a highly calculated, lethal trap. Claire stepped outside the bus terminal, the massive city roaring indifferently around her, and for the very first time since the heavy front door had slammed shut behind her, sheer, unadulterated panic broke through her practiced composure. If this fraudulent debt stood up in court, she could lose significantly more than just her money. She could completely lose her physical freedom to a prison cell. And if she lost this brutal fight, she could permanently lose custody of her child forever. Grant knew exactly what he was doing. He was a master manipulator who had built his entire corporate empire by ruthlessly crushing any uncertainty. And now, he was aggressively turning that exact same lethal skill directly onto her. Claire leaned heavily against a cold, damp brick wall, forcing herself to breathe slowly, in and out, demanding her legs not to collapse. Somewhere deeply buried, beneath the suffocating fear, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion, something else began to stir. It was a memory, a dire warning, a sacred promise sealed many years ago, explicitly meant for a terrifying moment exactly like this one. She whispered it softly under her breath, the words barely audible over the traffic. Not yet. Because if Grant Holloway actually thought this was the end of her story, he completely misunderstood the kind of woman he had cornered. And he had absolutely no idea how dangerously close she was to finally breaking her 15-year silence. What he had maliciously done to bury her in the dirt would very soon be the exact thing to drag him under the waves. By the third morning, Claire Whitmore stopped being an invisible ghost on the streets. Her name appeared first as a scandalous whisper in corporate circles, and then as a glaring, bold headline across the media. Grant Holloway stood confidently at a highly polished wooden podium inside a lavish downtown conference room. Massive, floor-to-ceiling glass walls perfectly framed the iconic Manhattan skyline directly behind him. Camera shutters clicked relentlessly. Microphones from every major news network clustered tightly together on the stand. His voice was incredibly calm, expertly controlled, and almost sickeningly regretful. He spoke fluently in the specific, arrogant language of powerful men who implicitly know that the public narrative belongs entirely to them. "This sudden separation is incredibly unfortunate," he said smoothly, folding his hands looking like a sorrowful statesman. "But as a leader and a father, I must take the necessary steps to protect my company, my hard-earned reputation, and most importantly, my beloved child." That last word landed like a jagged blade to the gut. Within mere minutes, the polished video clips spread like wildfire. Social media feeds were completely filled with cropped quotes and frozen frames of the press conference. There was Grant, looking incredibly composed, handsome, and dignified. And there was Claire, unseen, intentionally unnamed, yet already brutally judged and condemned by the court of public opinion. One major news outlet callously called her emotionally unstable and erratic. Another financial blog heavily implied severe financial recklessness. A third gossip site hinted darkly at marital betrayal without providing a single shred of evidence, expertly letting the nasty implication do all the heavy lifting. By noon, her face was absolutely everywhere. A highly unflattering, old photograph had mysteriously surfaced. It was one taken several years ago at a crowded charity gala. She was smiling brightly then, completely unaware that the candid image would one day be weaponized and used against her character. The cruel caption beneath it read, "Grant Holloway's estranged wife amidst divorce turmoil." Claire watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold from the corner of a small, dingy cafe near the river, slowly nursing a cheap black coffee she couldn't actually afford to finish. The small television mounted high above the counter replayed Grant's slick statement on an endless, maddening loop. Every few seconds, his smooth, lying voice repeated the exact same line, each repetition making her chest tighten painfully. All around her, oblivious strangers formed harsh opinions in real time. "Poor guy," a businessman muttered to his colleague. "She looks completely unstable." "Typical gold digger," another woman said, shaking her head at the screen. Claire kept her tired eyes cast downward. She desperately wanted to stand up and scream at the top of her lungs that absolutely none of it was true. She wanted to scream that she had never, ever touched his dirty money without permission, and that she had personally built significantly more of his corporate success than anyone in that building knew. She wanted to yell that she had stayed in the background and remained silent, not because she was a weak, submissive fool, but because she was explicitly told to do so for the sake of their family. Instead, she simply swallowed her pride and said nothing. Her cracked phone buzzed again on the table. This time, it wasn't a news notification. It was a direct message request on social media from a completely unfamiliar name. Lena Crawford. It was the much younger woman Grant now proudly introduced to the world as his new partner. The message was incredibly short, surgically precise, and breathtakingly cruel. You easily could have just left quietly. You actively chose this destruction. Claire stared blankly at the glowing screen until the harsh words completely blurred around her. The busy cafe buzzed loudly with life that felt impossibly painfully distant from her reality. She realized right then that Grant wasn't just trying to beat her in a legal courtroom. He was actively, maliciously, trying to destroy her socially, publicly, and permanently. And horrifyingly, it was working perfectly. An hour later, another devastating blow landed. A woman who had been her closest friend for a decade abruptly canceled their lunch plans via a cold text. A distant cousin she reached out to simply stopped replying. Even a prestigious charity board she had once dedicated hundreds of volunteer hours to quietly and swiftly removed her profile from their website overnight. One by one, every single door to her old life was slammed shut. Not with loud noise or arguments, but with polite, freezing, cowardly silence. By early evening, Claire walked aimlessly along the freezing river. The massive city was glowing brilliantly, carrying on exactly as if absolutely nothing had changed. She had truly never felt smaller in her entire life. Not when she painfully withdrew from law school. Not when she blindly signed away control of her finances. Not even when the heavy front door had slammed shut behind her. That first night, this was entirely different. This was a complete, systematic erasure of a human being. She sat heavily on a cold, wrought iron bench, her freezing hands clenched tightly in her lap, aggressively fighting the overwhelming urge to completely break down and surrender. Grant arrogantly believed that overwhelming public shame would quickly finish her off. He firmly believed that the crushing weight of public opinion would entirely crush whatever tiny sliver was left of her resolve. But he didn't know that shame had already done its absolute worst to her over the last 15 years. And he was entirely ignorant to the fact that what comes immediately after a woman's silence is broken is not weakness. It's a reckoning. Because the louder Grant arrogantly spoke to the press, the closer he dangerously came to fully exposing the terrifying truth he was so desperate to bury forever. The towering courthouse smelled strongly of harsh industrial disinfectant and old, decaying paper. It was a depressing, sterile place where entire human lives were casually reduced to manila folders and assigned file numbers. Claire Whitmore arrived for her hearing entirely alone. She walked slowly through the invasive metal detectors, carrying absolutely nothing but a worn leather handbag and a chilling, stoic calm she definitely did not actually feel. Her Modest heels echoed entirely too loudly on the polished marble floor. Each solitary step seemingly announcing to the world exactly how horribly exposed and vulnerable she was. Inside the cavernous courtroom, Grant Holloway was already comfortably seated. He didn't even bother to look at her at first. He was completely surrounded by three high-priced, aggressive attorneys in perfectly tailored suits. Their expensive laptops were open. Their yellow legal pads were filled with neat, calculated handwriting. They leaned in close to each other, looking incredibly confident, slick, and highly rehearsed. This was incredibly familiar territory for them. For Grant, this room was just another corporate boardroom to conquer. Claire took her designated place at the empty, opposite table. There was absolutely no one sitting beside her. No lawyer, no friend, no family. Hushed, scandalous whispers rippled quickly through the crowded public gallery. Behind her, curious, judgmental faces turned to stare. Some people recognized her from the morning news broadcasts, others from viral social media clips that had been maliciously stripped of all context and mercy. Claire could physically feel the heavy, crushing weight of their collective judgment press hard against her spine, but she stubbornly kept her eyes locked, facing forward. The judge finally entered the room, his robe swishing. Formalities immediately followed. Court dates were rapidly read aloud. Legal motions were listed off in rapid-fire succession. Claire, drawing on her buried law school education, understood every single terrifying word. That was honestly the cruelest part of it all. She knew exactly how incredibly badly this was going for her. Grant's lead, silver-haired attorney stood up first. He spoke incredibly smoothly, maintaining a tone of deep, fake respectfulness, expertly painting a vivid picture for the judge that was almost terrifyingly convincing. He described a powerful, responsible executive desperately trying to protect his legacy company. He described a loving, deeply concerned father worried about domestic instability. And then, he carefully, surgically suggested that the wife was entirely emotionally compromised, mentally unstable, and wildly financially irresponsible. Claire fiercely clenched her hands together under the heavy wooden table until her knuckles turned white. Then came the devastating issue of child custody. The slick attorney confidently slid a mountain of documents across the high bench to the judge. Each piece of paper was another brutal, calculated blow. There were fabricated records of missed payments, massive, unverified corporate debts, and wild, baseless allegations seamlessly presented as undeniable facts. Claire desperately opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself against the lies. But the judge immediately raised a stern hand to silence her. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said evenly, his tone completely detached. "Do you currently have legal representation present with you today?" Claire swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "No, Your Honor." There was a long pause. It wasn't overtly unkind, but it was incredibly, brutally final. The crushing ruling came swiftly and without mercy. Temporary, full custody was awarded immediately to Grant. Claire was granted only highly restricted, supervised access, pending a full psychological review. Claire felt the horrifying words hit her chest exactly like blunt force trauma. The entire courtroom violently blurred at the edges as the heavy wooden gavel struck the block with a deafening crack. Just like that, in a matter of minutes, it was entirely done. Her life was stripped away. Grant finally turned his head and looked directly at her. His handsome expression was perfectly composed, looking almost sickeningly sympathetic for the benefit of the gallery. But there was something incredibly dark and malicious hiding just beneath it. Pure, unadulterated satisfaction. He stood up gracefully as the judge exited the room, casually buttoning his expensive suit jacket with deliberate, arrogant calm. As he walked past Claire's empty table, he leaned in just close enough so that only she could hear his whisper. "I explicitly told you," he said incredibly quietly, his breath grazing her ear. "You really should have just stayed quiet." He turned and walked away down the aisle without ever looking back. Claire remained completely frozen, seated at the defendant's table long after the large room began to empty out. The hard wooden bench felt freezing cold beneath her sweaty palms. She stared blankly at the exact place where Grant had just stood, her ears ringing loudly, her throat tight with unshed tears. Losing her beautiful house had hurt. Losing her good name and reputation had cut even deeper. But this? Losing her child? This was absolute, total devastation. Outside the heavy courtroom doors, a swarm of reporters waited impatiently, hungry and completely relentless for a tearful quote. Claire quickly slipped out, through a hidden side corridor, her heart pounding so violently against her ribs. It felt as if it might break free. Once she reached the absolute safety of a deserted, concrete stairwell, she finally let herself collapse. She leaned heavily against the cold cinder block wall, her breath coming in ragged, violently shaking gasps. This was exactly what Grant had meticulously planned. Total, undeniable collapse. No financial support, absolutely no legal leverage, and seemingly no future. And yet, somewhere buried deeply beneath the suffocating grief and the paralyzing fear, a very familiar, strong voice echoed loudly in her memory. It was a voice that was incredibly steady and absolutely certain. When you have finally lost absolutely everything, you are finally, truly allowed to move. Claire straightened up incredibly slowly, wiping her wet face with the back of her trembling hand. She absolutely wasn't finished. She wasn't even close to being done, because the arrogant man who had just callously taken her child had absolutely no idea how dangerously close he was to signing his own spectacular undoing. Claire fully expected deafening silence from her old life. What she absolutely didn't expect was for the ultimate betrayal to come directly from the absolute. One place she still genuinely trusted. The devastating email arrived just after sunset, exactly when the sprawling city outside her cheap, dingy motel room glowed in depressing shades of muted orange and smoggy gray. She had been sitting frozen on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring blankly at the horrific custody paperwork yet again, obsessively reading the exact same legal lines until the words completely stopped making any logical sense. The bold subject line glowing on her phone screen froze her fingers. Mid-movement, regarding your legal case. It was an email from Martin Keller. He was her former, trusted attorney, and the absolute only lawyer in the city who had actually known her before Grant completely rewrote her life narrative. He was the kind man who had once told her, over coffee, with genuine, paternal concern in his eyes, that she deserved so much better than a life of submission and silence. Her hands trembled violently as she clicked it open. Claire, due to newly disclosed, highly sensitive information, I can absolutely no longer represent you in this matter. I strongly advise you to consider settling with Mr. Holloway's team as quickly as possible. This is simply not a battle you can ever win. There was absolutely no further explanation provided. There was no phone call to soften the blow. Just a quiet, cowardly withdrawal wrapped neatly in sterile legal language. Her stomach violently dropped through the floor. Mere minutes later, her cracked phone buzzed loudly again. This time, it was an automated push notification directly from the state's secure court portal. A brand new legal document had just been officially submitted under her name. It was labeled as a sworn, notarized statement, one she knew for a fact she had absolutely never, ever written. She opened the attached PDF, her heart racing frantically, her wide eyes scanning the digital page in pure, unadulterated disbelief. It was a full confession. Or, at least, it was a masterful forgery specifically meant to look exactly like one. It was a horrifying, detailed admission of her supposed extreme financial recklessness, her severe emotional instability, and it concluded with a shocking, voluntary recommendation that her own maternal custody rights be permanently limited for the safety of the child. At the very bottom of the damning document was a digital signature. It was hers. Or, at the very least, it was a forgery executed perfectly enough to pass any initial judicial scrutiny. Claire physically felt all the breathable air violently leave her lungs. She read the horrifying document again, much slower this time, her panicked mind desperately struggling to keep up with the reality of it. The legal phrasing was incredibly precise, highly calculated, and totally ruthless. It was the exact kind of specific language elite lawyers used when they wanted to force a judge to immediately stop asking questions and close a case. Martin Keller had filed it on her behalf before formally withdrawing. The small, dingy motel room seemed to violently tilt on its axis. Claire stood up, entirely too fast. her vision heavily blurring as sheer, blinding panic surged, like electricity through her chest. This absolutely wasn't just grossly unfair. This was massive, federal criminal fraud, and it meant something infinitely worse than simply losing a civil family court case. It meant that Grant's money and influence had successfully gotten to Martin. He had bought her only ally. Her phone suddenly rang. It was a private number she didn't recognize, operating entirely against her better judgment. She answered it. "Claire," Martin's voice said. It was incredibly low, sounding deeply strained and ashamed. "I am so sorry. I really, truly am." "For what exactly?" she asked, though her breaking heart already knew the terrible answer. "There are massive, dangerous things happening behind the scenes that you simply don't understand," he said incredibly quickly, his words rushing together. "You are up against endless financial resources you can't even begin to imagine. Incredibly powerful, dangerous people. If you stubbornly keep pushing this in court, this will get incredibly, violently ugly for you. You maliciously filed a completely false, forged statement in my name," she said. Her voice was surprisingly, terrifyingly steady in a way that shocked even her. "You completely destroyed my only credibility." A long, heavy pause hung on the line. Then, he spoke very quietly. "I simply did what I had to do to survive." The line went completely dead with a click. Claire sank heavily back onto the lumpy mattress, her initial shock rapidly giving way to something infinitely colder and significantly more dangerous. Grant hadn't just built a massive, impenetrable legal wall around her. He had actively, intentionally poisoned the very ground beneath her feet. Any decent lawyer who ever touched her case now would look at that forged document first. Any judge would immediately question her sanity before ever hearing a single word of her actual truth. This was the ultimate, fatal move that was supposed to completely finish her off. She stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper, breathing incredibly slowly, physically feeling the immense, crushing weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. She was entirely alone, completely discredited, and totally cornered, like a wounded animal. Even the justice system she had once studied and deeply believed in had brutally turned its back on her. For a very long, agonizing moment, she genuinely considered just giving up. Then, she vividly remembered her late mother's face. She remembered the exact way her mother's strong voice never wavered when she had once told her, "If the world ever betrays you this deeply, Claire, it simply means you are finally standing in the exact right place." Claire slowly picked up her cell phone again. Her trembling fingers hovered nervously over the keypad, staring at a specific 10-digit phone number she had memorized years ago but had absolutely never used. It was a highly secure number. She was explicitly told to call only when there was truly, absolutely nothing left in the world to lose. She hadn't called it yet. But after tonight's betrayal, she finally knew it was time. Because when even the sacred law turned its back against her, Claire Whitmore was, finally, truly ready to unlock the devastating truth that would completely, violently tear Grant Holloway's entire world apart. The final, fatal notice arrived just at dawn, stamped heavily in cold, official, legal language that intentionally left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. Claire read the heavy document once, then meticulously read it again, her pale hands remaining perfectly steady while her resting pulse roared deafeningly in her ears. It was a massive civil claim, an outstanding, defaulted corporate loan, and her name was explicitly listed in bold print as the primary, liable guarantor. The dollar amount listed was absolutely staggering. It was the specific kind of massive, multi-million-dollar number that didn't just threaten your financial comfort, it completely threatened your lifelong freedom. She sat rigidly on the edge of the cheap motel bed. Weak, early morning sunlight, leaking pathetically through the thin, stained curtains, and desperately tried to piece together exactly how this had happened. The dates on the contract simply didn't line up with reality. The signatures looked slightly off, but close enough. Yet, absolutely everything else about the packet looked terrifyingly, undeniably real. There was authentic bank letterhead, official, notary seals, and a timeline that perfectly placed the massive loan approval squarely during the chaotic, final year of her marriage. Grant's ultimate, fatal move was suddenly, horrifyingly clear. If the federal court actually believed this massive debt was legally hers, she wouldn't just lose custody of her child. She could easily face decades in federal prison for massive financial fraud. Her public credibility, which was already deeply cracked by the forged statement, would permanently, irreparably, shatter into dust. Absolutely no judge on earth would ever trust a word she said. No reputable lawyer would ever risk their license touching her radioactive case. And Grant would happily walk away completely clean, shaking his head sadly for the cameras, acting exactly as if she had brought this entire tragedy upon herself through her own mental illness. Claire closed her tired eyes and forcefully commanded herself to breathe. She vividly remembered the late nights sitting at their custom kitchen table while Grant reviewed massive corporate contracts. He would casually slide a stack of papers toward her, asking her to just take a quick look. He had always said it, so casually, so incredibly affectionately. You're honestly so much better at catching these details than my highly paid people are, he would joke, pouring her wine. She had willingly corrected complex clauses, accurately flagged massive financial risks, and carefully explained dire legal consequences that he always expertly pretended not to fully understand. Somewhere deep in those late, wine-soaked hours, he had systematically, maliciously learned exactly how to weaponize her own legal competence directly against her. Her phone buzzed loudly again on the nightstand. This time, it was a voicemail. Notification from a completely unknown number. She pressed play. Miss Whitmore, an older man's voice said. It was incredibly professional and sharply clipped. This urgent message is regarding the massive outstanding balance currently associated with your account. Failure to respond to our office within 72 hours will immediately result in further severe legal action. 72 hours. Claire laughed softly into the empty room. The sound was incredibly thin, dark, and utterly humorless. 3 short days. She had exactly 3 days to somehow legally prove a massive, multi-million-dollar lie she hadn't even known existed. Until this morning. 3 days with absolutely no money to her name, no lawyer to defend her, and a public reputation already expertly painted as violently unstable. Grant hadn't just set a clever legal trap. He had timed the execution of it absolutely perfectly. She stood up and began pacing the length of the small, dingy room. Painful. Memories were violently colliding with the terrifying present. She remembered the incredibly careful, manipulative way Grant always framed his controlling decisions as protection, the smooth way he aggressively insisted on handling all the marital finances so she wouldn't have to stress and worry her pretty head, the chilling, satisfied way he had smiled at her when she finally blindly stopped asking him hard questions. This was the ultimate, devastating price of blind trust. By midday, her paralyzing fear finally gave way to something infinitely sharper and significantly more dangerous. Pure anger. Yes, but also crystal clear. Clarity. Claire sat down with a pen and began rapidly listing absolutely everything she still had left in her arsenal. She still had her brilliant photographic memory. She still had her elite legal training. She still had her uncanny ability to read the hidden intentions between the lines of a contract. And, most importantly, she possessed one final, explosive thing she had fiercely protected all these years without ever fully understanding exactly why. A name. She quickly opened her worn leather bag and carefully pulled out a very slim, yellowed envelope. She had carried this specific envelope from place to place, from house to house, for over a decade. It had remained completely unopened, utterly untouched. Her late mother's elegant, flowing handwriting stared back at her, looking incredibly familiar and unshakably steady. Inside the envelope was a single, heavy card, and a long phone number written in dark ink that had only slightly faded with the passage of time. Call this only when there is absolutely no other way out. Claire held the thick card delicately between her trembling fingers. The immense, historical weight of the moment settling heavily over her shoulders. Grant arrogantly believed that this massive, fake debt would completely crush her before she could even manage to stand up. He genuinely believed she was utterly alone in the world. He was catastrophically wrong. She picked up her cracked cell phone, hesitated for only a fraction of a second, and then began to dial the long string of numbers. The secure line rang exactly once, then twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. Whitmore Trust, an incredibly calm, professional, and chillingly steady voice. Answered. How may we assist you today? Claire swallowed the massive lump of fear in her throat. My name is Claire. Whitmore, she said incredibly quietly, but with absolute resolve. And I think it is finally time you knew exactly what they've done to me. On the other end of the secure line, a profound, heavy silence fell. Because a massive, heavily guarded door that had been tightly sealed shut for decades had just been violently unlocked. The phone call ended completely without ceremony. There were absolutely no grand promises made, no soothing words of emotional reassurance offered. There was just a quiet, professional acknowledgement of her identity, and one single, chilling sentence that stayed echoing in Claire's mind long after the line went completely dead. We will be in touch shortly. She sat perfectly still on the bed for a very long moment, the dead phone resting heavily against her ear, intently listening to the hollow, humming silence that followed. For agonizing years, she had always imagined that this specific moment would instantly feel like a grand rescue, like a wave of pure relief. Instead, it felt exactly like standing barefoot on the crumbling edge of something vast, ancient, and incredibly dangerous, with absolutely no guarantee that the ground would actually hold her weight. By late afternoon, sheer, bone-deep exhaustion had completely settled into her aching joints. She walked aimlessly through the sprawling city with absolutely no destination in mind, anonymously passing massive crowds of people who had no idea her entire life was violently unraveling in real time. Unbothered people laughed loudly in cafes. Yellow taxis honked aggressively in the gridlock. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played a light, hopeful, upbeat tune that felt almost intentionally cruel to her ears. Claire finally stopped in front of a massive, imposing public library and quickly went inside, instinctively drawn by the promise of warmth and absolute quiet. She sat down at a long, scratched wooden table, methodically spreading out all the legal papers she carried in her bag exactly like bloody evidence from a complex crime scene. The terrifying debt notice, the forged, damning confession statement, the brutal, final custody ruling. Each official document told the exact same tragic story from a slightly different, horrifying angle. You are losing everything. She gently traced the worn edge of the yellow envelope her mother had left behind, vividly remembering the exact rainy day it was gravely handed to her. She had been barely 20 years old at the time, incredibly angry, fiercely stubborn, and utterly convinced she didn't need anyone's archaic protection. Her mother, already sick and fading, had forcefully pressed the sealed envelope into her young hand anyway. You absolutely won't need this for a very long time, her mother had said. Her voice weak but made of steel. And I pray to God you never, ever do. Claire had simply nodded dismissively, tucked the envelope safely away in a drawer, and proceeded to build a comfortable life that seemed safe enough to make the secret entirely unnecessary. Now, Sitting entirely alone in the echoing library, she finally understood the immense, crushing weight of that long-ago moment. Her brilliant mother absolutely hadn't been paranoid, and she hadn't been planning for simple failure. She had been meticulously planning for total betrayal. As the long afternoon faded into a chilly, dark evening, Claire's phone suddenly buzzed again on the wooden table. It was a news email notification this time. Her damaged heart jumped violently before she could stop it. But it absolutely wasn't the return call she expected from the trust. It was yet another hit piece. Article. Grant had just completed another highly publicized, exclusive television interview. This one was noticeably softer, much more intimately personal. He spoke eloquently to the host about his profound heartbreak, about making incredibly difficult, agonizing family decisions. He spoke smoothly about how some fragile people, he said incredibly gently, looking directly into the camera lens, simply couldn't handle the immense pressure of a high-profile life. And how they tragically lashed out in anger when things didn't go their way. He masterfully never actually said her name out loud, but he absolutely didn't have to. The public comments scrolling beneath the article were significantly worse than the interview itself. She should just accept the divorce and move on. It sounds like she's definitely hiding something shady. That poor kid, having to grow up with a crazy mother like that. Claire closed her eyes tightly, the cruel, ignorant words burning like acid behind her eyelids. Grant absolutely wasn't just patiently waiting for the slow legal system to finish her off. He was aggressively, proactively shaping the entire world's opinion of her so thoroughly that when the actual truth finally came out, absolutely no one would ever want to hear it. That was the exact moment when her lingering fear finally gave way to absolute, unyielding resolve. If she cowardly stayed silent right now, she would successfully disappear. Entirely. She wouldn't just disappear from Grant's life, she would completely disappear from her own. The mysterious trust on the other end of that phone call absolutely hadn't promised to magically save her. They had only promised to listen. And the fact that they were listening meant that something massive was already moving in the deep shadows. As the quiet library prepared to close for the night, Claire meticulously packed up her legal papers and stood up tall. She honestly felt no physically stronger, and certainly no safer, but she felt fundamentally different. She felt entirely awake in a way she absolutely hadn't been in 15 years. Grant arrogantly believed she was still frantically reacting to his moves. He didn't realize that she had completely stopped reacting and had started actively preparing for war. Outside, the freezing night fell heavily over the city once again. The millions of streetlights flickering on one by one in the dark. Claire confidently walked out into the cold with incredibly steady, measured steps, completely unaware that somewhere far across the city, securely behind locked, heavy oak doors, ancient names were rapidly being pulled from dusty, old files, and complex Financial signatures were being meticulously compared by experts. Because the desperate, final call she had finally made would very soon trigger a massive, catastrophic response that the great Grant Holloway absolutely never saw coming. Grant Holloway slept incredibly well that night. High up in his sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse, the massive city hummed quietly far below him, exactly like a well-oiled machine that existed solely to serve his needs. Brilliant morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, glinting blindingly off polished steel and expensive glass, perfectly reflecting a highly curated life intentionally designed to look completely untouchable. Grant stood in the massive kitchen wearing a custom-tailored dress shirt, a hot cup of artisanal coffee in his hand, casually scrolling through the morning news. Headlines with a deeply satisfied, arrogant calm. Absolutely everything was going exactly as he had masterfully planned. The public narrative had securely settled in his favor. His wealthy corporate investors were completely reassured. The nervous board of directors was finally quiet. The fickle press had seamlessly moved on from asking probing questions to printing his fabricated conclusions as absolute fact. Claire Whitmore, his soon-to-be permanently erased ex-wife, had been successfully reduced to nothing more than a tragic, pathetic cautionary tale whispered about at elite brunch tables and exclusive executive lounges. He smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. In the sleek, modern kitchen directly behind him, Lena Crawford leaned casually against the marble counter, aggressively scrolling through her own phone. Already impeccably dressed in designer clothes for the day, she had moved her things into the penthouse incredibly quickly, acting confidently, exactly as if the massive, luxurious space had always inherently belonged to her. Grant actually really liked that specific trait about her. She absolutely didn't hesitate. She never apologized. She never asked for his permission to exist. "You're actually trending at #1 again today," Lena said lightly, not looking up from her screen. The whole sympathetic, heartbroken father angle worked significantly better than we even expected. Grant took another slow sip of his expensive coffee. Of course it did. He casually adjusted his stiff, monogram cuff, admiring his own handsome reflection in the dark glass of the oven. Years of exerting absolute control had taught him one fundamental, undeniable truth above all else: people will blindly believe absolutely anything you say, as long as you say it first. You say it incredibly calmly, and you say it with total, unwavering confidence. Claire had foolishly waited entirely too long to defend herself. Her prolonged silence had permanently buried her alive. "She'll eventually settle the case out of court," Grant continued dismissively. "They absolutely always do. Especially when they completely run out of money to pay their lawyers." Lena laughed softly, a cruel, tinkling sound. "She already has run out." They left the penthouse together shortly after, gracefully descending into the private, secure elevator that carried them down to the lobby exactly like modern royalty. Grant was so consumed by his own arrogance that he completely didn't notice the very slight, unusual tremor in his secure phone as it briefly lost its encrypted cellular signal between floors. He honestly wouldn't have even cared if he had noticed. At his executive office, the entire workday unfolded exactly like a triumphant victory lap. His massive, highly paid legal team briefed him efficiently on the accelerated timelines. The fraudulent, multi-million-dollar debt claim was moving rapidly forward through the courts. The forged, damning confession statement had done its toxic job perfectly. Any desperate attempt by Claire to reverse course now would simply make her look incredibly desperate, wildly unstable, and highly reactionary. And family court judges absolutely hated reactionary women. "She's completely boxed into a corner," one senior attorney said with a slick, satisfied grin. "There is literally nowhere left on earth for her to go." Grant nodded, deeply satisfied. Across the busy city, he attended a lavish, catered luncheon with highly influential potential partners. He smiled brightly for the flashing cameras, aggressively shook important hands, and projected an aura of total, unbothered ease. When someone at his table dared to mention the messy divorce in hushed, gossipy tones, he waved it off incredibly graciously. "It's just unfortunate personal matters," he said, looking appropriately solemn. "It's deeply painful, of course, but highly necessary for the safety of my child." That exact night, he proudly hosted a small, exclusive gathering at the penthouse. It wasn't officially billed as a celebration, just a casual get-together of close friends, wealthy political donors, and people who truly mattered in the city. Lena moved effortlessly through the crowded room, laughing flawlessly at exactly the right moments, already playing the role of the ultimate supportive woman of the house perfectly. Grant watched her admiringly from across the room, utterly convinced that he had successfully upgraded his entire life in the exact same efficient way he upgraded absolutely everything else, ruthlessly, highly strategically, and entirely without a single ounce of regret. What he absolutely didn't see, however, were the quiet, invisible ripples moving rapidly outward from a single, desperate phone call made days earlier. He completely didn't hear the intense, high-stakes discussions currently happening behind heavily locked, soundproof doors downtown. He didn't know that ancient, powerful names long buried had suddenly resurfaced, or that crucial, signed, legal documents he thought had been permanently destroyed were being meticulously pulled from highly secure, underground archives. To Grant, the grand game was completely over. Claire was utterly finished. He confidently raised his crystal glass of scotch to the room, offering a smooth, charming toast about embracing new beginnings and making hard choices. The crowded room responded with enthusiastic, polite applause. They were entirely unaware that they were currently standing on corporate ground that was already violently shifting beneath their expensive shoes. Grant smiled, warmly at his guests, utterly convinced of his own absolute invincibility. And that blinding certainty would very soon become the absolute most dangerous, fatal mistake of his entire life. The second, highly anticipated court hearing was scheduled with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. Claire received the official digital notice late the night before, heavily buried among dozens of automated court emails and threatening legal alerts that read much more like aggressive warnings rather than actual information. It absolutely wasn't a full trial yet. It was merely a procedural review, the specific kind of brief hearing meant to quietly finalize exactly what the judge had already practically decided. It was a heavy, iron door closing, cleverly disguised as a legal formality. She arrived at the courthouse incredibly early. She was dressed very simply, her physical posture incredibly calm, despite the massive, raging storm actively tightening inside her chest. The cavernous courthouse felt significantly colder this time around, and noticeably less curious. People wandering the halls no longer stopped and whispered when she walked by. They barely even looked at her at all. That total, apathetic invisibility scared her far more than their overt judgment ever did. Grant Holloway entered the room mere minutes later, looking as arrogant and confident as ever. His massive, expensive legal team completely surrounded him, exactly like a phalanx shield, murmuring rapid updates to him, nodding along in agreement. He glanced casually at Claire exactly once, just long enough to confirm with satisfaction that she was still sitting completely alone at her table. A look of deep, profound satisfaction flickered brightly across his handsome face before completely disappearing behind his practiced, corporate mask of utter indifference. He confidently took his seat without a moment's hesitation. The weary judge reviewed the thick case file with visible, deep fatigue. The heavily forged confession statement was already entered permanently into evidence. The massive, fraudulent debt claim had been officially acknowledged by the court. The devastating, temporary custody ruling sat heavily on the record, like a massive stone, seemingly immovable. This specific hearing was only meant to quickly smooth out the legal edges, absolutely not to change the catastrophic outcome. Claire listened intently as the complex legal motions were read rapidly aloud by the clerk. Her very name was spoken casually, exactly like she was nothing more than an annoying administrative inconvenience to the court's busy day. When the judge finally looked up and casually asked if she wished to add anything to the record before the rulings were finalized, Claire stood up, incredibly slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said clearly. The entire room subtly shifted. Grant's lead attorney raised a gray eyebrow, looking almost highly amused by her pathetic persistence. Claire absolutely didn't argue the fake facts. She didn't tearfully accuse Grant of forgery. She didn't even ask the judge for any sympathy. She simply and politely requested a brief, temporary continuance of the proceedings, citing the existence of newly discovered information that directly fundamentally impacted the basic legitimacy of the massive financial claims filed against her. The judge frowned deeply, clearly annoyed. Miss Whitmore, you have already made several desperate requests to this court. I completely understand that, Claire replied, her voice perfectly even and calm. But this specific request is entirely different. Grant's lead attorney stood up immediately, his voice booming. Your Honor, we strenuously object. This is a blatant, desperate delay tactic from a cornered party. My client has already been significantly more than generous throughout this process. There is absolutely no credible new evidence to support any further review of these established facts. Grant leaned back comfortably in his heavy chair, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the pathetic display quietly. He had fully expected exactly this. Total desperation at the very end always looked exactly like annoying drama. And he knew that overworked judges absolutely hated drama. The judge looked tiredly between the two tables. Do you actually have legal counsel present with you today, Miss Whitmore? Claire paused. She let the silence hang for just a fraction of a second too long. Not yet, she said softly. A collective, mocking murmur moved rapidly through the public gallery. The judge sighed heavily, clearly torn between following strict legal procedure and her own mounting impatience. Without official representation or immediate physical documentation to present, I am highly inclined to deny your motion and proceed with the rulings. Claire nodded exactly once. Then I respectfully ask the court to officially note, for the record, she said clearly, that I am formally and legally contesting the fundamental authenticity of all the financial documents submitted under my name in this case. Grant's attorney scoffed loudly. On exactly what grounds? Claire met his arrogant gaze head-on. On the explicit grounds that they were absolutely never authorized by me. A brief, highly uncomfortable silence followed her bold statement. The judge made a quick, irritated note in her file, but she absolutely did not look convinced by the claim. Your objection is duly noted for the record, she said dismissively. We will now proceed. Grant's attorney smiled a very faint, victorious smile, already moving on to the next motion. That was exactly when Claire noticed something highly unusual that she hadn't seen before. Sitting quietly at the very back of the massive courtroom, completely alone near the last row of benches, was a man. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, wearing an incredibly sharp, tailored dark suit, with absolutely no briefcase in sight. He definitely hadn't been there during the first hearing. He wasn't watching the judge, and he wasn't watching Grant. He was watching her intently. Their eyes met across the room for a split second. The mysterious man gave her the absolute, slightest nod of his head. It absolutely wasn't a nod of pity or reassurance. It was a nod of profound recognition. Claire's breath violently caught in her throat. Before her racing mind could even process it, the judge unexpectedly announced a mandatory short recess. People instantly stood up and stretched. Loud conversations sparked in the gallery. Grant's massive legal team gathered tightly around him, looking incredibly confident, relaxed, and victorious. The older man in the back row rose smoothly and moved silently toward the heavy double exit doors, passing directly behind Claire's table without saying a single word. But exactly as he walked past her, he deftly slipped something small onto the wooden table directly beside her hand. It was a small, heavy, folded card. Claire's fingers closed around it instinctively, hiding it from view. She opened it under the table. On the front of the thick, embossed card, written in incredibly neat, precise handwriting, were 4 powerful words that made her resting pulse violently spike. We are now involved. And for the very first time since this entire living nightmare had begun, Claire knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that the ground beneath Grant Holloway's feet was absolutely no longer solid. The massive courtroom settled back into its seats after the brief recess. But the very air inside the room felt entirely different now. It was significantly thicker, highly electrically charged. Claire sat perfectly, unnaturally still at her empty table, the folded card hidden safely beneath her palm like a dangerous, glowing secret with immense weight. She absolutely didn't look back toward the heavy wooden doors. She didn't need to. Whatever massive force had just stepped into her shattered life wasn't ever leaving again. Grant confidently returned to his chair, looking incredibly relaxed, casually, whispering a joke to his lead attorney. He glanced briefly over at Claire, noticing absolutely nothing unusual about her posture, and smirked exactly as if the last few minutes had only further confirmed what he already arrogantly believed. This entire hearing was just a boring formality, a very slow, inevitable walk to her total destruction. The judge cleared her throat loudly, adjusting her microphone. Let's continue. Grant's lead attorney stood up immediately, resuming his arguments with practiced, overwhelming confidence. He aggressively reiterated the massive financial claims, the alleged millions in debts, the supposed documented emotional instability of the mother. Every single damaging word stacked neatly on top of the last, rapidly forming an impenetrable brick wall that Claire was clearly meant to violently crash into. He confidently concluded his speech by aggressively requesting the court immediately move forward with permanent rulings without any further unnecessary delay. Miss Whitmore, the judge said, turning her tired gaze toward her. This is your absolute final opportunity to respond to these claims before the court proceeds to ruling. Claire rose to her feet incredibly slowly. For a brief, terrifying moment, her weak knees threatened to completely give out beneath her. But then she remembered the heavy card in her hand, the silent nod of recognition, and the powerful words written so incredibly calmly, exactly as if this terrifying outcome had always been fully expected. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing clear. I would like to formally introduce my legal counsel. The entire courtroom instantly stilled in shock. Grant's lead attorney blinked rapidly in utter confusion. Counsel, he repeated, loudly, completely unable to hide the sharp, panicked edge in his voice. Before the judge could even respond to the shock, a heavy wooden chair scraped softly against the polished floor at the very back of the massive room. The older man Claire had noticed earlier stepped confidently forward. He was completely unhurried, his movements highly deliberate and predatory. Every single step he took down the center aisle drew the absolute attention of the room without ever demanding it. He stopped directly beside her empty table, placing a sleek, incredibly expensive leather folio gently down on the wood. Good morning, Your Honor, he said. His deep voice was incredibly calm, terrifyingly authoritative, and unmistakably highly practiced in federal courts. Elliot Morrow, appearing on behalf of my client. A massive, shocked murmur violently rippled through the crowded room. Grant instantly straightened up in his seat, his smirk vanishing entirely. The judge adjusted her glasses, peering down at him. Mr. Morrow, she said, incredibly slowly, recognizing the heavy-hitter name. You are entering this case incredibly late in the proceedings. Only late on the court's calendar. Your Honor, Elliot replied smoothly, completely unfazed, but certainly not in legal substance. Grant's attorney practically leaped out of his chair. Your Honor, we strenuously object to this. This is highly irregular procedure. Elliot turned his head just enough to look the flustered attorney directly in the eye. So is intentionally submitting heavily forged financial documents to a federal judge, he said completely evenly. The heavy word forged landed in the quiet room like a dropped anvil. Grant's arrogant smile completely faltered, replaced by a flash of sheer panic. The judge raised a stern hand to stop the impending chaos. Mr. Morrow, you will definitely have a full opportunity to clarify that massive accusation. For now, please state your client's full legal name for the court record. Elliot nodded exactly once. My client, he said, slowly opening his leather folio, is absolutely not simply Claire Whitmore. Grant exhaled sharply, a sound of highly amused, forced disbelief. Oh, this ridiculous nonsense again, he muttered under his breath. Elliot absolutely didn't even look at him. For the strict legal purposes of this court, Elliot continued loudly, his voice echoing, her full legal name is Claire Elizabeth Whitmore Hale. The psychological effect on the room was immediate and catastrophic. The judge froze entirely mid-motion, her pen hovering over her notepad. Grant's lead attorney went completely, deathly still, his mouth falling open. Even the court clerk abruptly stopped typing on the stenographer machine. That specific, legendary name hung heavily in the stale air, incredibly heavy and utterly unmistakable, exactly like an ancient, rusted key violently turning the lock in a door that had been permanently sealed for decades. All the remaining color completely and instantly drained from Grant's handsome face, leaving him looking sickly pale. "Your Honor," Elliot added incredibly calmly into the stunned silence. "That specific name is legally and irrevocably associated with a massive, federally sealed blind trust. It is a trust that entirely predates this marriage and strictly supersedes absolutely every single financial claim currently sitting before this court." The judge's eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. "Proceed incredibly carefully with this, Mr. Morrow," she warned darkly. "Because if what you are actually implying here today is true—" "It absolutely is," Elliot replied without a shred of hesitation. Claire physically felt the entire room tilt on its axis. Not with terrifying fear this time, but with limitless, explosive possibility. She absolutely didn't look over at Grant. She didn't need to see his horrified reaction to know that something massive, fundamental, and entirely irreversible had just violently shifted in the universe. Because the ancient name he arrogant thought he had completely erased from the world was the exact name that was about to violently take absolutely everything back from him. And the stunned courtroom had only just barely begun to understand exactly what that legendary name truly meant. The profound silence in the courtroom immediately after Elliot Morrow spoke felt completely unnatural. Exactly as if the massive room itself had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Claire remained standing tall, her pale hands resting perfectly steady at her sides, while every single pair of eyes in the gallery slowly, collectively shifted away from a terrified Grant Holloway and locked directly onto her. The judge slowly removed her reading glasses, staring intently at the lawyer. "Mr. Morrow," she said incredibly carefully, weighing her words. "That is an incredibly significant legal claim to make. Do you fully understand the massive gravity of formally invoking a federally sealed trust in this family court?" "I absolutely do, Your Honor," Elliot replied smoothly. "Which is exactly why I would absolutely never invoke it lightly." Grant's lead attorney recovered his senses first. He stood up abruptly, his voice sharp with highly forced, desperate confidence. "This is nothing but a massive, desperate distraction. The supposed trust he's referring to is completely irrelevant to the immediate financial matters at hand. Miss Whitmore legally and willingly waived all financial claims during the course of the marriage." Elliot calmly turned a single, crisp page in his leather folio. "She absolutely did not waive them," he said calmly, "because, legally speaking, she could not." Grant leaned aggressively forward now, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the heavy wooden table. "That old trust was absolutely never activated," he snapped loudly, losing his composure. "It was entirely inactive, completely dormant. She never even disclosed it to me because it absolutely didn't matter." Elliot finally turned his head and looked directly at him with freezing contempt. "It was completely dormant by explicit legal design," he said. "And Full disclosure to a spouse was neither legally required, nor was it ever advisable under the strict conditions set by its founder. The judge's eyes narrowed sharply in curiosity. Founder? Elliot nodded respectfully to the bench. Claire Whitmore's late mother. A loud, excited murmur swept rapidly through the crowded room. Claire felt her chest tighten painfully, hearing her beloved mother spoken of in this cold, sterile place, in this terrifyingly high-stakes moment, made absolutely everything suddenly feel incredibly, viscerally real. This wasn't just a legal theory anymore. This was a battle for her legacy. The Whitmore Hale Trust, Elliot continued, his voice ringing out clearly, was meticulously established over 30 years ago. Its massive assets were entirely frozen under incredibly strict, ironclad legal conditions. This explicitly included a strict non-disclosure clause directly tied to marital coercion and severe financial dependency. Grant shook his head violently, sheer disbelief rapidly bleeding into pure, unadulterated anger. That's completely absurd. It's incredibly precise, Elliot corrected him without missing a beat. The massive trust could absolutely not be accessed, publicly disclosed, or financially leveraged by anyone while my client was financially dependent on a spouse, or subject to any form of marital pressure. Any aggressive attempt by a spouse to illegally exploit or control her personal finances would, in fact, automatically trigger a full federal review of the marriage. The judge leaned back incredibly slowly in her high leather chair, digesting the bombshell. And you are legally suggesting to this court, she said, that this specific automatic review has been triggered now. Yes, Your Honor. It has. Grant's attorney stammered, frantically flipping through his useless notes. Even if such a bizarre trust actually exists, it has absolutely no bearing on the massive debt claims or the custody matters currently before us. It has every legal bearing, Elliot interrupted, his tone still perfectly even, but lethal, because the trust significantly predates the alleged fraudulent debts, and because the forged documents recently submitted under my client's name conflict directly and fatally with the trust's heavily recorded federal protections. The judge held up a firm hand, immediately stopping any further argument from the defense. She turned her intense gaze directly to Claire. Miss Whitmore, she asked pointedly, were you actually personally aware that these specific, extreme protections existed? Claire nodded exactly once, her voice strong. I was fully aware they existed. Your Honor, she said, but I was explicitly instructed by the executor never to invoke them unless it became absolutely necessary for my survival. And do you honestly believe this specific moment qualifies as such? Claire met the judge's intense gaze without flinching, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Yes, Your Honor. I absolutely do. Grant stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his heavy chair. This is complete. An utter manipulation, he shouted, losing control. She's cowardly hiding behind ancient legal technicalities to avoid paying what she owes. Elliot didn't even raise his voice to counter him. "No, Mr. Holloway," he said, coldly. She was simply surviving behind them. The judge closed the thick case file resting in front of her with a quiet, terrifying finality that made Grant's stomach violently drop into his expensive shoes. "This court will absolutely not proceed any further today," she announced, loudly, banging her gavel. "Not until the absolute authenticity of these presented documents and the legal status of this sealed trust are fully, federally reviewed in chambers." Grant completely froze. For the very first time since this entire horrific nightmare began, he was absolutely no longer in control of the timeline. The narrative had violently slipped from his grasp. Claire sat down incredibly slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs, not with terrifying fear, but with something entirely new and intoxicating. Absolute, unstoppable momentum. Because the legendary name that had just stopped the entire courtroom dead in its tracks wasn't just purely symbolic. It was a massive, devastating legal fault line. And Grant Holloway had just blindly, arrogantly stepped directly onto it. The judge immediately ordered an emergency recess. And this time, it absolutely wasn't a routine coffee break. It was highly strategic. Armed court officers moved rapidly with quiet, intense urgency, quickly collecting sensitive files, hastily escorting the clerks, and aggressively sealing thick folders that had been sitting wide open mere minutes before. The packed public gallery buzzed loudly with heavily restrained, excited tension. Absolutely everyone in the room sensed it. This mundane divorce case had just aggressively crossed an invisible, highly dangerous line into federal territory. Claire sat perfectly still beside Elliot Morrow, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. Her heart was absolutely still racing, but it wasn't beating wildly with panic anymore. It was incredibly focused, highly controlled, exactly like a massive, powerful beast that had been asleep for years had finally, violently, woken up. Elliot smoothly opened his leather folio again, this time turning it directly toward the high bench. "With the court's explicit permission," he said smoothly, "I would like to formally submit our preliminary documentation for immediate in-camera review." The judge nodded sharply, eager for answers. "Proceed." What Elliot carefully placed before the waiting court clerk absolutely wasn't overly dramatic. There was no grand, theatrical reveal. It was just a relatively thin, unassuming stack of heavily watermarked papers, bound very neatly. It looked incredibly understated, almost modest. And yet, Grant's terrified attention was completely locked onto them, exactly as if they were live explosives about to detonate in his face. "These certified documents," Elliot continued, his voice echoing explicitly, "include the original trust registration, the notarized historical amendments, and strict third-party financial verification from two highly independent federal fiduciary institutions. Grant's lead attorney rose halfway out of his seat, panicking. Your Honor, we have absolutely not had the required time to examine any of this supposed evidence. You will eventually, the judge replied curtly, glaring at him. Sit down immediately and be quiet. Grant swallowed incredibly hard, sweat beading on his forehead. As the clerk handed the heavy file up to the bench, the judge began reading it. In absolute silence, her stern facial expression shifted almost imperceptibly. With each turning page, a sharply raised brow here, a long, pregnant pause. There, a significantly longer, scrutinizing look at an ancient signature. Claire watched her face incredibly carefully. Many years ago, Claire's dying mother had patiently explained to her exactly why. The massive trust had to be built this specific way. She explained why. Absolutely everything had to be heavily layered, legally delayed, and aggressively protected by cold, calculating people who would absolutely never become emotionally involved with her. Immense power always attracts immense pressure, she had said weakly from her bed. So, the legal protection must be designed to completely outlast any human emotion. Claire honestly hadn't fully understood the depth of those words at 20 years old. But she truly, deeply understood them now. Mr. Morrow, the judge said incredibly slowly, finally looking up from the pages, her eyes wide with shock. These legal protections are unusually specific. Yes, Your Honor, Elliot replied simply. They were meticulously designed for a very specific, anticipated threat. Grant couldn't stay quiet any longer. His ego wouldn't allow it. This is completely absurd, he snapped aggressively. If she actually had legal access to anything even remotely like this kind of wealth, she would have used it years ago to fight me. Elliot slowly turned toward him, facing him fully for the very first time in the room. She couldn't use it, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. And you actively made sure of that. The horrifying words landed significantly harder than any shouted accusation ever could. The trust explicitly includes a brutal coercion clause, Elliot continued, his voice perfectly measured so the entire gallery could hear. If my client's total financial independence was ever compromised through marriage, heavy manipulation, or the illegal restriction of access to joint funds, the massive trust would legally remain permanently sealed until those exact toxic conditions completely ended. Grant's attorney went sickeningly pale, realizing the massive trap they had just walked into. That explicitly means, Elliot added with a shark-like smile, that the exact moment Miss Whitmore was forcibly, physically removed from her marital residence, completely cut off from all marital assets, and maliciously subjected to total financial isolation by your client. This trust officially became eligible for immediate federal review and activation. The judge looked slowly back down at the damning papers, And what about the alleged multi-million-dollar debt? She asked. Elliot confidently slid forward another single document. It is already under massive federal forensic analysis. Preliminary indicators strongly suggest that the signature on the loan was entirely digitally replicated from archived private marital filings. Grant's breath hitched violently in his throat. This court will obviously require full, independent verification of that claim, the judge said, closing the folder incredibly carefully. But based solely on what I clearly see here today, the financial narrative presented by the plaintiff thus far is completely, maliciously incomplete. Grant stared blankly down at the wooden table. His supreme, arrogant confidence visibly draining out of his body with every passing second. Claire physically felt something heavy and dark completely settle inside her soul. It absolutely wasn't toxic triumph. It wasn't petty revenge. It was pure, unadulterated validation. For the very first time in 15 years, the system wasn't just loudly speaking over her. It was finally, quietly listening to her. The judge looked up, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. This hearing is officially adjourned pending federal review, she announced loudly. And Mr. Holloway? Do not ever assume that this court will move quickly in your favor again. Grant didn't even attempt to respond. He literally couldn't. Because the highly illegal, forged documents he arrogantly thought would absolutely never surface were now sitting safely in the hands of the absolute one person on earth he couldn't manipulate or control. And the massive, dirty paper trail he had so carefully buried years ago was about to tell the world a very, very different story. The mysterious envelope arrived early the very next morning. Delivered. Absolutely not by standard mail, but securely by a bonded, armed hand courier. Claire was sitting quietly in a massive, opulent conference room inside Elliot Morrow's elite firm. The bustling city of New York was entirely visible through the tall, soundproof glass windows that completely muted the chaotic noise of Manhattan into a faint, distant, peaceful hum she honestly hadn't slept much at all. Pure adrenaline and momentum carried her body forward, but a bone-deep exhaustion lingered heavily in her joints like a flashing warning light. Elliot entered the room without saying a word and placed the sealed envelope incredibly gently on the glass table directly between them. Claire recognized it instantly. The thick paper was incredibly old, significantly thicker than modern stationery. The edges were slightly worn and yellowed, exactly as if it had been lovingly handled many times over the years, but absolutely never actually opened. Her late mother's beautiful, flowing handwriting stretched proudly across the front, steady and unmistakable. Her chest tightened painfully with sudden emotion. I honestly didn't even know this letter existed, Claire whispered, reaching out. Elliot nodded respectfully. It was securely held in a vault under strict legal instruction. It was only to be released to you if the core trust was ever formally challenged in court under highly coercive, abusive circumstances. Claire's pale hands hovered nervously over the old envelope. For a long, terrifying moment, she simply couldn't bring herself to physically touch it. Her beloved mother had been dead and gone for so many years. The raw, agonizing grief had finally settled into something manageable, something quiet and dull. Opening this letter violently threatened to tear that old wound wide open again. She took a deep breath and broke the heavy wax seal. Inside was a single, thick letter, folded exactly once. The dark ink was slightly faded with age, but still perfectly, beautifully clear to read. My dearest Claire, if you are actually reading this letter, then the difficult, painful life I so desperately hoped you'd never have to endure has tragically found you anyway. Claire swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes. Her mother's written words were incredibly calm and laser-precise, exactly as if she had written them, possessing psychic knowledge of exactly when they would be desperately needed. She wrote eloquently of true love without blind naivety, of toxic power cleverly disguised as male protection, and of dangerous men who would inevitably mistake a woman's quiet patience for weak permission. I meticulously built this trust not because I ever doubted your strength, but because I trusted your good heart entirely too much. I knew you would endure pain significantly longer than you ever should. I knew you would stubbornly stay silent significantly longer than is ever safe for a woman to do. Hot tears completely blurred the page. The profound letter meticulously explained absolutely everything Elliot had only vaguely hinted at in court. Yesterday, the strict conditions, the endless delays, the exact reason Claire had been strongly urged by the executors to live incredibly simply, to depend on absolutely no one fully, and to never, ever reveal the massive wealth that lay hidden beneath her real name. It absolutely wasn't total secrecy born of paranoia or fear. It was pure, unadulterated strategy. If an arrogant man ever actively tried to completely erase you from the world, her mother wrote fiercely, let the massive legal system speak for you. Let the absolute, undeniable truth arrive in the room without your voice ever having to shake. Claire let out a long, incredibly shaky breath, wiping her wet cheeks. At the very bottom of the old letter was one final, powerful paragraph. It was visibly written much more firmly than the rest. The heavy pen had literally pressed harder into the thick paper. When the time for justice finally comes, my sweet girl, do not ever seek petty revenge. Seek absolute restoration. Exactly what is yours will rightfully return to you. Exactly what is not will violently fall away on its own. Claire closed her eyes, hot tears finally slipping free and falling onto the glass table. Elliot remained entirely silent in his chair, respectfully giving her the safe space she desperately needed to grieve. When she finally looked back up, her entire facial expression had profoundly changed. The deep grief was absolutely still there. Yes, but it was firmly anchored now. It was held tightly together by absolute purpose. This letter, Elliot said incredibly carefully, will be officially entered into the federal court record, not as explicit evidence of your massive wealth, but as undeniable evidence of her legal intent. Claire nodded slowly, understanding the gravity. She meticulously planned for this exact day. Yes, he said, a look of profound respect in his eyes. And she brilliantly planned for you to survive it. Across the busy city, an arrogant Grant Holloway sat blissfully in his massive office, completely unaware that a ghostly voice he had absolutely never even heard was about to completely, violently dismantle the fake story he'd spent years building. He had foolishly believed the past was permanently buried, and that death easily erased all loose ends. He was catastrophically wrong, because the dead, especially when they leave the absolute truth behind in ink, have a terrifying way of speaking significantly, louder than the living ever could. Claire carefully folded the precious letter along its original crease and placed it safely back in the envelope. For the very first time in 15 years, she absolutely wasn't afraid of what came next, because the powerful woman Grant had tried so desperately to violently silence had just been fully given back her voice by someone he could absolutely never threaten, intimidate, or control. Grant Holloway had always arrogantly trusted paper significantly more than he ever trusted living people. Complex contracts absolutely didn't hesitate. Forged signatures absolutely didn't lie. Dark ink, once dried, was considered permanent. That specific, cynical belief had successfully built his entire corporate career, closed his most ruthless deals, and easily justified every single immoral decision he'd ever made in his life. It was also the exact same blind belief that would spectacular undo him. The next emergency hearing took place entirely behind heavily closed doors, completely absent of flashing cameras, public gallery spectators, and juicy tabloid gossip. This time, the private judge's chambers felt significantly smaller and much tighter, exactly as if the wood-paneled walls themselves were actively listening to the impending doom. Grant sat incredibly rigid in his leather chair, his strong jaw visibly clenched in anger, while Elliot Morrow stood perfectly calmly across the table from him. A very slim, unassuming manila folder resting lightly in his hands. Claire sat directly beside Elliot, utterly silent. She had finally learned that silence, when weaponized and used correctly, was absolutely no longer a weakness. The judge meticulously reviewed the profound letter from Claire's late mother. First, she didn't read it emotionally or theatrically, but with the incredibly sharp, laser focus of someone highly trained to read lethal intention hidden between lines of text. When she finally finished reading, she carefully set the letter aside and looked directly and piercingly at Grant. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice like ice, "you have stated repeatedly and emphatically on the record that you personally managed all marital finances during this marriage." "Yes," Grant replied immediately, his voice tightly controlled. "Entirely with my wife's consent." "And you legally maintain the judge continued, peering over her glasses. That. Absolutely all financial instruments and documents signed during the course of the marriage were completely legitimate and authorized. They absolutely were, he said firmly, not breaking eye contact. Elliot stepped forward smoothly. Then you absolutely won't object to reviewing. Just one of them for the court today, he said, slowly sliding a single, highly redacted document across the polished table. Grant glanced down at it dismissively. At very first, he absolutely didn't react. At all. Then, his eyes completely stopped moving across the page. Claire watched in sheer fascination as the healthy color violently drained from his handsome face in distinct, horrifying stages. First came total confusion. Then, horrifying recognition. And finally, pure, unadulterated fear, sharp and unmistakable. That specific document, Elliot said completely evenly, letting the words hang. In the air is a highly conditional legal waiver you personally, physically, signed exactly 8 years ago. Grant shook his head frantically, panic setting in. That's completely impossible. I never. It was cleverly attached as an obscure rider to a massive restructuring agreement for one of your very early corporate acquisitions, Elliot continued, smoothly, cutting him off. You were heavily advised by your own team that it was just routine paperwork. The judge leaned in closer, highly intrigued. A legal waiver of what? Exactly. Mr. Morrow? Elliot didn't answer her immediately. He sadistically let the heavy silence do the agonizing work for him. A complete waiver of spousal financial obstruction, he said at last, his voice echoing. In plain, layman's terms, Mr. Holloway legally signed an ironclad agreement explicitly stating that if he ever actively restricted, maliciously manipulated, or illegally falsified his spouse's access to her own independent assets, he would immediately and permanently forfeit any legal claim to contest their full restoration in court. Grant stood up abruptly, his chair screeching loudly. That is absolutely not what that contract was. Elliot met his terrified gaze with eyes of stone. It is exactly what it was. He turned the document around so the judge could clearly see the bottom of the page. At the very bottom, Your Honor, Elliot said, is Mr. Holloway's verified personal signature. It is fully notarized and digitally time-stamped. The judge pulled out her reading glasses and studied the ink incredibly closely. Claire felt something profound and heavy completely settle inside her soul. It wasn't toxic triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was absolute, final closure. Grant's highly paid attorney whispered frantically to him, desperately flipping through his own massive files. Sheer, unprofessional panic visibly bleeding through every single movement he made. Grant himself looked completely trapped, exactly as if the solid floor beneath him had finally, violently given way to a bottomless pit. I absolutely didn't know, Grant said sharply, his voice cracking with desperation. I was completely misled by my legal team. You were explicitly warned, Elliot replied incredibly calmly. You just arrogantly didn't think the rules ever applied to you. The judge closed the folder with a loud snap. Criminal intent will be thoroughly examined at trial, she said firmly. But this verified signature drastically changes the entire scope and jurisdiction of this case. Significantly, Grant sank heavily back into his chair, completely stunned into silence. For years, he had aggressively used complex signatures to ruthlessly control others, to legally corner them into submission, and to end difficult conversations before they even began. Now, one of his very own, careless signatures had violently turned against him like a rabid dog. Claire finally broke her silence, looking at him with immense pity. I truly trusted you, she said incredibly quietly. And you maliciously used that beautiful trust as leverage to destroy me. Grant didn't respond to her. He literally couldn't. Because the very specific thing he arrogantly believed fully protected him had miraculously become the exact instrument of his total, catastrophic fall. And the tiny, careless signature he barely even remembered signing was about to cost him absolutely everything he thought he owned. The massive corporate collapse didn't happen all at once in a fiery explosion. It happened incredibly slowly, in agonizing layers, with each one quieter and significantly more devastating than the last. Grant Holloway had fully expected loud outrage from the court. He expected a massive, drawn-out argument, endless legal negotiation, and strategic delay. Tactics. What he absolutely didn't expect was the sudden, horrifying stillness that immediately followed the judge's federal order. There were absolutely no raised voices in the room. There were no dramatic, booming objections from his team. There was just a series of incredibly calm, lethal procedural decisions that began systematically dismantling his entire world, piece by piece. The very first massive blow was financial. Pending a full federal review, the court immediately ordered a complete, temporary freeze on all disputed corporate assets connected to the marriage. That massive freeze explicitly included several highly lucrative, hidden holding accounts that Grant had always arrogantly considered completely untouchable. The judge's ruling was incredibly precise, deeply clinical, and totally irreversible. His lead attorney leaned in closely to aggressively whisper fake reassurances. But Grant barely even heard him. His panicked mind was already racing miles ahead, frantically calculating his impending financial losses, the massive corporate consequences, and his terrifying legal exposure. The second, significantly heavier blow came much faster. An elite, independent forensic auditing team was immediately assigned by the court to thoroughly review the massive, fraudulent debt filings submitted under Claire's name. Elliot had brilliantly anticipated this move. The judge had, too. What Grant absolutely hadn't expected was exactly how incredibly quickly the glaring inconsistencies surfaced once someone competent actually looked closely at the paperwork. The dates simply didn't align. The digital metadata absolutely didn't match the IP addresses. The forged signatures showed undeniable digital artifacts that were completely inconsistent with Claire's known historical records. What had once looked perfectly airtight under friendly, paid scrutiny began to aggressively unravel under neutral, federal eyes. By the time the court officially adjourned for the day, the horrifying word fraud hadn't actually been spoken aloud on the record yet, but it absolutely didn't need to be. It hung thickly in the air. Outside the heavy courthouse doors, Grant's cell phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket. He had dozens of missed, frantic calls from his panicking CFO. There was a curt, highly threatening message from a senior board member demanding immediate clarification. There was another from a massive foreign investor, aggressively requesting an emergency, off-the-books meeting. The supreme, unshakable confidence he had carried for weeks evaporated entirely. With every single buzzing notification, Claire walked calmly out of the building beside Elliot. The bright afternoon sunlight caught her face in a beautiful way it hadn't in a very long time. She didn't smile for the cameras. She absolutely didn't celebrate her victory. She simply took a deep breath, exactly as if drawing air into her lungs had suddenly become infinitely easier to do. Inside Grant's massive executive office later that afternoon, the entire atmosphere had shifted completely. Loud, joking conversations instantly stopped, dead the exact moment he entered the room. Employees' eyes dropped awkwardly to the floor. The exact same sycophantic people who had once laughed easily and loudly at his terrible jokes now spoke incredibly carefully to him, meticulously measuring every single word they said. By evening, his new mistress, Lena, was completely gone. There was absolutely no dramatic, screaming argument in the penthouse. There was no tearful physical confrontation. There was just a completely empty, sprawling walk-in closet and a very short, typed note left on the marble counter that simply said she desperately needed some distance right now. Grant stared blankly at the piece of paper significantly longer than he should have, violently realizing entirely too late that fake loyalty built strictly on financial advantage absolutely never, ever survives actual risk. The emergency board meeting that night was incredibly brief, and it was utterly brutal. Grant was formally asked to step aside from his company temporarily. He wasn't officially removed yet, not quite yet, but he was permanently sidelined. For the very first time in his entire illustrious career, he was absolutely no longer the smartest man in the room steering the conversation. He left the quiet boardroom intimately knowing that this temporary pause was only the absolute beginning of his end. That night, entirely alone in the massive penthouse that suddenly felt entirely too large and echoing, Grant poured a heavy glass of expensive drink and stood by the massive window. He stared blankly out at a glittering city that completely no longer seemed to belong to him. He replayed every single arrogant decision, every careless signature, every cruel moment. He had completely dismissed Claire's profound silence as weak surrender. Across town, in her modest, warm apartment, Claire sat quietly at the kitchen table with Elliot, methodically reviewing the next crucial legal steps, the final custody hearings, massive asset restoration, and criminal accountability. It was incredibly overwhelming. Yes, but it was absolutely real. Grant had foolishly believed that immense power meant absolute control. He was rapidly, painfully learning that absolute power without any moral restraint inevitably collapses under its own massive weight, because the massive legal system he had tried so hard to weaponize against Claire was now doing exactly what it was inherently designed to do, violently correct an extreme imbalance. And Grant Holloway was discovering, in the most painful way possible, that the terrifying fall from absolute certainty is infinitely steeper and faster than the difficult climb to the top ever was. The next, highly anticipated hearing arrived completely without public spectacle. There were absolutely no flashing cameras crowding the courthouse steps today. There were no aggressive reporters shouting invasive questions. The high-profile case had officially moved entirely past cheap public theater and into something infinitely more dangerous for Grant Holloway: quiet, absolute accountability. Claire sat peacefully at the heavy wooden table directly beside Elliot Merrow. Her posture was incredibly relaxed, yet highly alert. She wore absolutely no flashy statement pieces, no designer armor cleverly disguised as elegance. She simply didn't need them anymore. The very atmosphere of the room had changed entirely, and so had the respectful way people looked at her. It wasn't with pathetic pity, and it absolutely wasn't with dark suspicion. It was with profound, undivided attention. Grant entered the courtroom incredibly late. He physically looked significantly smaller than before, his famous, arrogant confidence completely frayed and burned at the edges. The powerful man who once effortlessly filled massive rooms now seemed to take up physical space highly reluctantly, acting exactly as if he were desperately hoping not to be noticed by anyone. His once massive legal team had thinned out considerably. Only his lead attorney remained by his side, nervously flipping through thick pages with forced, jerky precision. The judge reviewed the updated, devastating federal findings incredibly methodically. Elite forensic analysis had officially, definitively confirmed that the massive debt documents were entirely falsified. The signature had been meticulously, digitally reconstructed using old, archived marital records. The entire timeline of the loan was completely manufactured. The criminal intent, while technically still under review, was absolutely no longer ambiguous to anyone in the room. Grant stared straight ahead at the wall, his jaw locked so tightly it looked painful. Then came the massive question absolutely everyone in the gallery expected Claire to answer with venom. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "given these highly disturbing findings, you may officially pursue massive financial damages, heavy legal sanctions, An immediate criminal referral to the DA. The entire room waited with bated breath. Grant's attorney tensed visibly. Grant himself finally turned his head and looked directly at her. His bloodshot eyes, sharp with something incredibly close to pure, unadulterated fear. This was the exact moment he'd imagined so differently in his nightmares, the brutal moment. She would finally, viciously strike back and destroy him. Claire stood up incredibly slowly. She physically felt every single eye in the room burning into her. But she absolutely didn't rush. When she finally spoke, her voice was incredibly calm, remarkably steady, and unmistakably her own. Your Honor, she said clearly, I am absolutely not here today to maliciously punish anyone. Grant blinked rapidly in sheer shock. I am simply here to legally correct exactly what was violently stolen from me. Claire continued, her voice echoing in the quiet room. My good name, my public credibility, and my sacred relationship with my child. A low, shocked murmur moved quickly through the room. Elliot, what's its hit? Incredibly closely from his chair, completely ready to step in if she needed him. But Claire didn't even look down at him. She absolutely didn't need any legal guidance now. I am formally requesting total restoration, she said firmly. Not retaliation. Grant's lead attorney exhaled a very long, slow breath, looking entirely unsure whether to feel profoundly relieved or deeply unsettled by her mercy. The judge nodded slowly, highly intrigued. Be highly specific, please. Claire didn't hesitate for a single second. Full, immediate dismissal with extreme prejudice of all fraudulent claims filed against me. Immediate, full restoration of my maternal custody rights pending final review. And a public, formal acknowledgement by this court that the financial narrative previously presented by the plaintiff was entirely false. The judge made several quick notes on her pad, then looked back up. You are absolutely not seeking massive, punitive financial damages? No, Your Honor, Claire said simply. Grant's head snapped violently toward her. For the very first time, his icy composure cracked completely. Why? He demanded loudly, blurting it out before his attorney could even try to stop him. Claire met his desperate gaze with absolute pity. Because exactly what you did, to me, absolutely doesn't define who I am becoming, she said softly. And because forcing you to live with the devastating consequences of your own actions is punishment enough. Absolute, deafening silence followed her words. It wasn't awkward, and it wasn't tense. It was entirely decisive. The judge closed the thick file with a loud snap. This court will grant all the requested relief immediately. Grant slumped heavily back in his chair, completely and utterly stunned. Outside the courtroom, as they exited down the long hall, Elliot spoke, incredibly quietly to her. You know, you easily could have taken absolutely everything he owned. Claire nodded, looking straight ahead. I know I could have, but I didn't. I simply took exactly what was mine, she replied. and that is more than enough. Across the hall, Grant watched her walk gracefully away, realizing entirely too late that the incredible woman he had so badly underestimated had completely outgrown the primal need to destroy him. Because true justice, when it finally arrives without malice or cruelty, leaves a guilty man with absolutely nowhere left to hide. And Grant Holloway was about to painfully face a lonely life completely stripped bare, not by her petty revenge, but entirely by his own undeniable truth. The long, echoing hallway outside the courtroom felt significantly brighter than it ever had before, even though absolutely nothing about the architecture had actually changed. It was the exact same polished marble floors, the exact same muted, echoing footsteps, the exact same distant, depressing echoes of other people's messy problems. But for Claire Whitmore, the immense, crushing weight she had been physically carrying for agonizing months, long years, and maybe even longer, had finally permanently shifted off her shoulders. She stepped proudly outside the massive glass doors into the bright, warm afternoon light and simply stopped walking. For the very first time since the heavy door of her old, toxic home had slammed violently shut behind her in the rain, she allowed herself to just stand perfectly still, completely without any lingering fear of what terrible thing might come next. Elliot stood quietly beside her, as unobtrusive and calm as always. He absolutely didn't rush her to the car. He inherently knew that this specific, profound moment wasn't about filing paperwork or legal strategy anymore. It was entirely about self-recognition. You did exactly what your brilliant mother intended for you to do, he said, finally breaking the comfortable silence. Claire nodded slowly, her dark eyes stinging sharply, absolutely not from sadness, but from overwhelming, pure release. She just desperately wanted me to remember exactly who I was, long before I ever became someone's submissive wife. The official, permanent custody order was safely handed to her in a sealed folder right before sunset. It was technically labeled temporary, pending final review, but it successfully restored exactly what had mattered to her most. The humiliating, supervised visits were officially ended. Her full, parental, decision-making rights were entirely returned. The legal language on the page was incredibly precise, highly formal, and unmistakably clear. Claire read it twice, and then once more, her pale hands perfectly steady. When she finally saw her child later that same evening, there were absolutely no dramatic, weeping reunions for the cameras, and no hysterical tears shed in public places. There was just a very quiet, warm room, tiny, familiar arms wrapping fiercely around her waist, and a sweet, familiar little voice asking nervously, "Are you finally staying for good now?" Claire knelt down onto the carpet and held on incredibly tight, exactly as if the entire world might violently tilt on its axis again if she didn't hold on. "Yes," she whispered fiercely into soft hair. "I am always right here." That night, She stayed comfortably in a very modest, simple apartment that had been arranged quickly through Elliot's office. It was absolutely nothing extravagant, nothing highly symbolic. It was just a space with clean white walls, warm, inviting light, and a physical space that belonged absolutely, entirely only to her. She unpacked her 2 suitcases incredibly slowly, consciously choosing exactly what to place where, actively relearning the simple, beautiful power of making her own decisions. The massive, staggering trust paperwork arrived via courier the very next day. There was absolutely no falling confetti, no wild celebration, just quiet, legal confirmation. The frozen assets were officially unfrozen. The massive bank accounts were fully restored under her legal name alone. The ironclad protections were activated, and federal oversight was established. Absolutely everything her late mother had meticulously built, not as a weapon of vengeance, but strictly as an impenetrable safety net, now sat quietly behind her. Exactly like a massive brick wall she no longer had to fear facing. Claire didn't even touch most of the money. Not yet. What she did aggressively reclaim immediately, however, was her good name. Her impeccable professional record was publicly corrected. The highly publicized false statements were formally, legally withdrawn from the press. The federal court officially issued a massive public clarification stating that the financial narrative previously presented to the media had been completely, maliciously inaccurate. It wasn't exactly a groveling apology from the system, but it was close enough to truly matter. People in her old circles immediately noticed the shift. Hundreds of emails arrived in her inbox. Some were highly cautious, some were deeply curious, and some were profusely, embarrassingly apologetic. Claire answered absolutely none of them right away. She was entirely uninterested in frantically repairing burning bridges that had been happily set on fire without a moment's hesitation. Across the massive city, a ruined Grant Holloway watched her rise from a pathetic distance. He clearly saw her leave the federal courthouse again days later, looking incredibly calm, perfectly composed, with absolutely no flashy entourage and no desperate public spectacle. He tragically realized right then that the absolute worst part of his massive loss wasn't financial. It was deeply existential. He absolutely no longer occupied any space in her life at all. Claire had completely, effortlessly moved past him. That horrifying realization hollowed out his ego significantly more deeply than any judge's ruling ever could have. Claire stood peacefully by her apartment window that quiet evening, watching the brilliant city lights blinking on one by one in the dusk. Her innocent child, fast asleep in the next room. She didn't feel toxically triumphant. She felt profoundly grounded. She had lost absolutely everything she thought she wanted. And in the agonizing process, she had magically gotten back exactly what she desperately needed herself. But as profound peace finally settled into her bones, one absolute final reckoning still waited in the wings, because some devastating consequences absolutely don't arrive loudly in federal courtrooms. And Grant's slow, agonizing demise was only just beginning. True healing absolutely didn't arrive crashing down like a massive tidal wave. It came incredibly slowly, in tiny, fragmented pieces, completely unnoticed at first, tucked quietly into ordinary, mundane moments that Claire had entirely forgotten how to value. Mornings in her new apartment became incredibly quieter, but absolutely not empty. It was quiet in a beautiful way that allowed free thought to exist, entirely without fear of interruption. Claire woke up peacefully before the busy city stirred, padding barefoot across the warm hardwood floors to make fresh coffee, happily listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of her child from the next room. There were absolutely no rigid schedules dictated by someone else's selfish priorities. No heavy, suffocating tension lurking in the silence. She had completely forgotten what true safety actually felt like. The apartment remained intentionally, beautifully modest by design. Claire easily could have chosen to rent something significantly larger, something incredibly impressive, something that proudly reflected the massive financial power now legally returned to her. She didn't want to. Space, she happily learned, was absolutely not measured in square footage, but entirely in the profound absence of control. She bravely began going to therapy again, not to obsessively unpack the trauma of the court case, but to actively reclaim the vibrant parts of herself that had painfully learned to minimize, to constantly wait, to endlessly endure. Some days in the chair, she spoke freely and easily. Other days, the painful words stayed stubbornly trapped behind 15 years of highly practiced, silent restraint. Both experiences were entirely allowed. Grant's name came up in a session exactly once. I absolutely don't want to carry his ghost forward with me, Claire said, incredibly quietly to her therapist. I already physically carried him for long enough. The therapist nodded warmly. That was enough. Weeks peacefully passed by. The massive city outside changed seasons beautifully. Around her, the leaves on the trees along the busy sidewalks shifted from green to brilliant gold. The daylight shortened. Life continued on, completely indifferent to her personal victories and her profound losses. Claire found immense comfort in that fact. The world absolutely didn't pause for human pain, and it certainly didn't demand a fake performance for true recovery. She eventually began working again, very slowly. She started consulting independently, meticulously reviewing corporate contracts, and happily helping small law firms navigate complex legal gray areas without exploiting innocent people. She chose her new clients incredibly carefully, finally trusting her razor-sharp instincts for the very first time in years. When she firmly said no to a project, absolutely no one ever argued with her. At night, she happily read storybooks to her child until sleep came easily to them both. There were inevitable questions sometimes about why things had changed so drastically, about why they suddenly lived somewhere new. Claire always answered them incredibly honestly, completely without toxic bitterness, and without providing ugly details that simply didn't belong to a child. "We're completely safe now," she always said with a warm smile. And that is exactly what matters most. Across town, Grant Holloway's life also grew incredibly quieter, too. But absolutely not in the same peaceful way. His deafening silence was incredibly heavy and suffocating. Federal investigations moved rapidly and aggressively forward. Lavish invitations to elite parties completely stopped arriving in his mailbox. Wealthy people who once desperately sought his attention now actively avoided his phone. Calls like the plague. True. Devastating consequences rarely announced themselves loudly with a bang. They arrived slowly, by agonizing subtraction. Claire absolutely didn't track his public downfall. She didn't need to. Maintaining a healthy distance was a crucial part of her healing. One quiet evening, Elliot visited the apartment briefly to finalize some mundane legal documents. They quickly reviewed closing timelines, legal formalities, and financial boundaries. Before leaving, he paused thoughtfully at the front door. "You've successfully done what very few people ever manage to do," he said. Softly, "You completely stepped out of the toxic cycle." Claire smiled a very faint, genuine smile. "I simply stepped back into myself." After he left, she stood peacefully at the large window, the bright city lights reflecting softly against the clean glass. For agonizing years, she had foolishly mistaken silent endurance for true strength. Now, she finally, deeply, understood that true strength was a conscious choice. The choice to finally rest. The choice to actively rebuild. The choice to completely stop proving anything to anyone who didn't matter. She didn't feel toxically victorious. She felt entirely whole. And in that profound wholeness, she absolutely no longer needed the dark past to explain her bright future. Because true healing wasn't just the complete absence of scars. It was the complete, undeniable absence of fear. And as Claire happily settled into a beautiful life entirely defined by her own decisions, the absolute final chapter, one of undeniable, catastrophic consequence, was quietly, inevitably moving toward its end for Grant. Grant Holloway's arrogant world absolutely didn't end with a flashy headline. It thinned out painfully until there was nothing left. The very first warning sign was the deafening silence of his cell phone. There were no more morning text alerts from frantic assistants. No more exclusive invitations labeled urgent. No more last-minute favors cleverly disguised as elite friendships. The expensive device still worked perfectly, but the powerful world it had once securely connected him to had quietly and permanently stepped away in disgust. He sat completely alone in his dark, cavernous office long after the sun had set. The lights turned completely off, the massive city glowing brilliantly. Beyond the glass, exactly like a vibrant life that absolutely no longer recognized his face. The massive company logo proudly displayed on the wall felt entirely foreign to him now, a symbol he absolutely no longer controlled. His interim suspension from corporate leadership had been indefinitely extended by the board. Standard financial reviews had rapidly escalated into massive federal audits. Casual office conversations had turned incredibly cautious and suspicious. Absolutely no one accused him outright to his face. They didn't need to. The federal investigation moved aggressively forward, without any need for public spectacle. Massive financial irregularities, gross document manipulation, severe ethical breaches. Each devastating finding landed softly on the board's desk. But together, they formed an undeniable, ironclad verdict he absolutely couldn't outrun. The corporate board officially issued a damning press statement publicly, distancing itself from his personal conduct. His name technically remained on the building, but only barely. Exactly like old ink slowly fading from a forgotten piece of paper. Grant miserably packed his massive office in painful stages. First came the personal items, then the heavily framed magazine articles praising his genius. Then the heavy glass awards. Each and every one of them felt infinitely lighter in his hands than it should have, completely stripped of the profound meaning and power he once arrogantly believed they carried. He left the large wall entirely empty, unsure exactly why that specific, minor detail unsettled his stomach the absolute most. At home, the massive penthouse echoed hollowly. The overwhelming quiet absolutely wasn't peaceful. It was highly accusatory. The massive rooms held ghosts and memories he could absolutely no longer control or spin. They were painful reminders of moments he had casually dismissed as completely insignificant at the time. Claire's incredible calm, her profound silence, the highly observant way she watched him instead of emotionally reacting. He had foolishly, fatally mistaken her brilliant restraint for pathetic weakness. That massive, fatal mistake replayed endlessly in his mind on a loop. One dark evening, he stood entirely alone at the exact same window where he had once arrogantly toasted his new beginnings with his mistress. The cold glass perfectly reflected a pathetic man he barely even recognized anymore. He looked significantly older, incredibly smaller, and utterly uncertain. The absolute, blinding certainty that had once anchored his massive ego had completely dissolved into nothing, leaving behind only terrifying questions he absolutely didn't know how to answer. He thought deeply of Claire then, not with misplaced anger, and surprisingly not even with lingering regret, but with profound, sheer disbelief. She had bravely walked away from him without ever looking back. There were absolutely no screaming speeches, no petty, vindictive revenge plots, no desperate attempts to ruin him publicly in the tabloids. She simply hadn't needed to do any of that. Her complete absence did all the devastating work for her. It brilliantly exposed the ugly, rotting truth he had kept heavily buried beneath years of toxic control and blinding arrogance. Grant desperately tried to reach out to her just once. He typed out a long, Pathetic text message, but it stayed permanently unsent in his drafts. Because exactly what could he possibly say to her now that wouldn't sound exactly like pathetic, cowardly self-preservation? Days later, the absolute final legal notice arrived via courier. A formal, legally binding request for his permanent resignation from the company. It was carefully worded, highly professional, and utterly final enough to matter. He signed it silently, completely without ceremony, for the very first time in his entire life. His arrogant signature meant absolute, total loss. Outside his dark window, the massive city moved on without him. It always did. Brilliant new faces quickly replaced old ones. Exciting new stories aggressively pushed past his. Grant Holloway officially became a pathetic, tragic cautionary tale, whispered about mockingly among the very same people who had once deeply envied him. Massive power misused, toxic control foolishly mistaken for strength, and a quiet woman's profound silence fatally underestimated. Across town, Claire happily lived her beautiful life entirely without his dark shadow. She absolutely didn't track his spectacular downfall in the news. She didn't need to physically witness his pain to feel completely whole. His devastating consequences were absolutely no longer her responsibility to bear. Grant finally truly understood that. Now, sitting entirely alone in a massive, expensive space that no longer felt earned, he forcefully faced the absolute truth he had cowardly avoided for years. He hadn't lost absolutely everything just because Claire bravely fought back. He lost absolutely everything because he arrogantly believed he was completely untouchable. And the massive, unyielding legal system he had so maliciously tried to bend to, his will had finally, violently bent back and crushed him. Because the ultimate end of Grant Holloway absolutely wasn't loud, explosive, or dramatic. It was simply the quiet, permanent, agonizing loss of all his relevance, his trust, and his total control. The beautiful morning Claire officially, permanently closed the heavy door on her traumatic past. There was absolutely no grand ceremony to mark the occasion. Warm, golden sunlight filtered softly and beautifully through the apartment. Windows, incredibly soft and entirely unhurried. The massive city outside moved with its usual chaotic rhythm, completely unaware that something incredibly final and profound had already happened. Claire stood peacefully in the doorway of her child's room, lovingly watching sleep rise and fall in a steady, peaceful, rhythmic pattern. That simple, beautiful sight grounded her soul significantly more than any federal judge's ruling ever could. She had finally learned that true, lasting endings absolutely didn't require an audience or witnesses to be real. Her life had beautifully settled into a shape that felt incredibly honest. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfectly grand. But it was honest. Claire worked entirely on her own terms now, actively choosing legal projects that truly mattered to her, and happily declining those that absolutely didn't. Her name now carried a profound, quiet respect in the city, not because it was defended loudly with PR spin, but because it was absolutely no longer questioned by anyone. People eventually completely stopped asking her about Grant. When his disgraced name did occasionally surface in conversation, it felt incredibly distant to her, exactly like a boring story she'd once read in a book but had never fully lived. The massive scandal had faded entirely into a distant memory, permanently reduced to a minor footnote in elite business circles. He absolutely no longer defined her timeline. He never truly had. One quiet evening, as vibrant autumn light spilled like gold across the living room, Claire received a very brief call from Elliot. It was strictly administrative. The absolute final legal confirmations had successfully gone through. The massive trust was fully, permanently stabilized. The custody arrangement was officially permanent. There were absolutely no remaining messy legal threads left to tie up. "You're completely free," Elliot said simply. Claire thanked him profusely and hung up the phone, surprisingly feeling absolutely no massive, overwhelming rush of adrenaline or triumph. Freedom, she profoundly realized in that quiet moment, wasn't just a fleeting, dramatic moment in time. It was a permanent condition of the soul, one she had already confidently stepped into months ago. That night, she happily cooked a warm dinner while her child sat swinging their legs at the kitchen counter, chattering endlessly about school. The innocent conversation wandered aimlessly, as children's conversations often do, landing finally on a very simple, profound question. "Are we finally okay now?" Claire paused from cooking, just long enough to be absolutely certain of her answer. "Yes," she said with a bright, genuine smile. "We absolutely are." Later that night, long after the dishes were washed and the apartment lights were dimmed low, Claire stood by the large window one absolute last time. The sprawling city glowed warmly, looking incredibly familiar and entirely unthreatening. For agonizing years, she had survived by living inside other people's toxic expectations, foolishly measuring her own self-worth by exactly how well she endured their abuse. She absolutely didn't need to do that anymore. Her phone suddenly buzzed on the table with a new message she didn't bother to open right away. It could wait. Absolutely everything could wait for her now. She had nowhere left in the world she needed to prove herself. And absolutely nothing left she needed to frantically reclaim. She had already happily received exactly what mattered most: her powerful voice, her innocent child, and her bright, unwritten future. Claire turned away from the window and walked confidently back into her beautiful life, closing the door softly but firmly behind her. Not in lingering anger, and absolutely not in fear, but with absolute, unshakable certainty. Some endings exist only to brutally punish us. Some endings exist to beautifully redeem us. This specific ending simply restored the universal balance Grant Holloway tragically lost absolutely everything he so desperately tried to control. Claire Whitmore beautifully gained exactly what she was always meant to keep, and absolutely nothing in her entire world ever needed to change again for that to remain the absolute truth. The story didn't tragically continue on into bitterness, it beautifully resolved itself. Because her absolute greatest victory wasn't just winning the massive court case. It was the profound peace of knowing she would absolutely never, ever need to fight like that again. The story has officially come to a beautiful close now. And if you are still right here with us at this exact moment, then something profound in this intense journey must have truly touched your heart in a very quiet, deeply personal way. Maybe this story reminded you of a painful time when you stayed silent, significantly longer than you ever should have. Maybe it perfectly reflected a terrifying moment in your own life when the world aggressively stripped absolutely everything away, and you desperately had to find out exactly who you really were without the noise, without the safety nets, and without the toxic people holding you back. Claire's incredible story absolutely isn't just about winning a lawsuit or losing a husband. It is deeply about actively remembering yourself. As the brilliant Stoics taught us, you have absolute power over your own mind, not over outside events. And also, what stands in the way becomes the way. The immense pain she suffered absolutely didn't break her. It clarified her purpose. True healing didn't come from seeking petty, vindictive revenge, but from actively reclaiming her dignity, establishing ironclad boundaries, and finding true inner peace. And that is exactly something we can all bravely carry forward into our own lives. When the world feels incredibly unfair, when your profound silence feels exactly like pathetic weakness, please always remember this: patience is absolutely not surrender, and maintaining your calm in a storm is absolutely not defeat. Sometimes, the absolute bravest, most powerful thing you can ever do in this life is to take a step back, take a deep breath, and fiercely choose exactly who you're going to become next. If this powerful story deeply resonated with you today, if it spoke directly to a heavy burden you're currently carrying, please take a quick moment to like this video. Share it right now with someone in your life who might really need to hear it today. And please subscribe to the channel. Your incredible support helps us keep telling beautiful stories that actually heal the soul, not just entertain. Thank you so much for staying until the end, and I will see you in the next video.